In the northern folds of a river valley where iron gates wear green teeth of moss and sycamores keep secrets in their bark, a stone house rose that no map would name. Locals whispered about the hill house, the quiet farm, the place your grandmother would not mention, but above a narrowed arch the weathered stone still reads St. Elora Asylum of Restoration, 1862. For generations people walked past its path and did not see it. That was the point. I found it by accident, or more truthfully, I found a ledger that smelled of mildew and old rain. I was cataloging parish papers at the university when a mislabeled box released the smell of vinegar and paper. Beneath funeral notices and brittle correspondence lay a small leather-bound book sealed with a black ribbon. Across the cover, in flaking gilt, someone had written St. Elora Admissions and Fates, 1862-1890. Inside were 143 entries. Each was a first name, then a number, then a final column that read, most often departed. No dates, no explanations. Some lines bore only an X, names pressed in ink like prayers: Clara, Elsie, Winterfred, Joe. After that night I could not sleep. I dreamed of faces at narrow windows, of laughter swallowed beneath floorboards, of a bell tolling where there was no tower. I took a leave and drove to the Hollow. In a Route 29 diner, an older waitress, her hair pulled tight, considered my questions and then whispered, "You mean the Hill House? If this voice finds you, type 'The veil is broken' twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Subscribe to follow this thread and write your town below. Tell me where forgetting happens." St. Elora opened in winter. 12 girls between 9 and 16 carried inside by promises of moral repair. Some were orphans. Others came from households that paid to make a daughter vanish. Too restless, too clever, too troublesome. They arrived with trunks and prayers and were given numbers, grey uniforms, hair cropped. Names were taken as routinely as shoes. The women who ran the place called themselves midwives of the spirit. Their theology was simple: empty the vessel, then refill it with light. What followed was discipline disguised as devotion, so they sanctified absence. Not by accident, Mother Agatha Vale arrived with 3 trunks, a worn Bible, and a presence that quieted rooms. Small of frame, she spoke with the temper of stone. Her gaze lingered like accusation. In private letters later found in attics, she claimed visions. A luminous figure kneeling in ash demanding a house to purify the girls of a nation. She framed the project as salvation, not confinement, and the language of charity made complicity easy. Her inner circle read like an organizational chart of cruelty. Sister Rebecca Marcella, taught in Pinel convents, perfected corporal penance. She designed the stations of reflection, ritual humiliations, forced kneeling in rice until feeling left the limbs, enforced starvation and public reproach. Sister Eugenie, once an apothecary, maintained a locked cabinet of tinctures. Her teas and draughts blurred nights, dissolved memory, and produced fevered visions later presented as holy revelations in chapel. Brother Thorn, tall and mute, built the architecture of concealment reflection chambers, night corridors, bolted trapdoors, the laundry furnace, and the silent tunnels by which staff moved unseen. Sister Isolde, the record keeper, erased. She rewrote families' letters, forged signatures, answered inquiries with templated phrases that softened absence into progress. She kept 2 ledgers, a clean white book that lived in diocesan stacks, and a hidden red ledger with terse notations, numbers a single word, and intentions. The house used a taxonomy: FS for fit for servitude, GC for grave candidate, TT for transferred. For the rich, dismissal was soft, occasional letters a promise of spiritual growth. For the poor, arrival could mean chains. The classification determined everything: bedding quality, diet, work, whether one saw sunlight or was routed to a cellar that never emptied. This was not improvised violence. It was a system refined to ritual. Staff rotated in 3s, always silent, always precise. New journals were seized and burned. Reports were forged. Inspections that did occur were courteous and brief. Outside, war and disease occupied the public imagination. Inside St. Elora, the machine for forgetting ran with bureaucratic calm. The ledger's 143 lines were not clerical mistakes. They were the result of people choosing to look away. In the ledger's columns, the words departed, ascended, transferred, or blank were deliberate choices intended to erase not only bodies but histories, to tidy disappearance into sacrament and paper, left the world. The house was built to kill sound. Floors of stone and high ceilings, walls double-lined with lime plaster and horsehair, windows narrow and high. Doors bolted from the outside. Dormitories had names no one said aloud: the Hall of Salt for scrubbing newcomers' knees raw, the Dorm of Grace for the obedient kept for placement, the Cold Ward for the sick or disruptive who seldom returned. Arrivals followed a liturgy. Names were removed, numbers assigned. Hair cropped, uniformed in grey. For 30 days they endured vocal fasting, no whisper, no hum, no audible sob. An infraction brought reflection, an unlit cell so small it reformed time. Some girls came back thin and confused of their own limbs. Others simply did not return. Work filled the hours with silent motion: laundry, mending, field labour, chapel rites, all conducted by a rotation called the quiet choir. At night Brother Thorn moved like a shadow, lantern in hand, a jangling keyring announcing that he had decided something. Beds were numbered and stripped each morning, whether occupied or not. A bed taken meant a line in a ledger and a sheet folded away. Clara Mullin was number 41. She hid a sliver of chalk in her mattress seam and carved crosses beneath the slats each time a friend disappeared. By the 12th week there were 6 marks. She memorized names like prayer: Elsie, who drew birds in dust; Winterfred, who cried against the cold glass; Joe, who joked to keep others from losing their breath. When a hand reached into the dark and found only cold linen, the girls learned silence as survival. Punishment could be communal. When one asked aloud where someone had gone, Sister Marcella imposed atonement: 3 days without food, a single hymn repeated until voices frayed, and renewed silence. Chapel confessions were orchestrated. Visions coaxed with draughts, testimony shaped, conversion performed. Over time, the meaning of self narrowed. Hope was economized into gestures small enough to fit into a uniform sleeve. Beneath the chapel, a furnace hissed in a building called a laundry house. Staff explained it as heat for linen. But Brother Thorn's footprints often led there at night. Narrow observation slits lined the corridors. Staff could watch without being watched. Reflection chambers sat behind heavy doors. Rooms where a child might be left until she unstitched herself of memory. Each architectural choice was punitive. Walls were instrument, witness to erasure. The selection process at St. Elora was surgical. It began with a letter, handed quietly to a priest or family advisor, and ended with a carriage at dawn. Wealth bought soft departures, poverty bought chains. The staff developed an appraisal within an hour of arrival. Sister Rebecca would sit with a new child under the guise of welcome prayer, and, with the skill of an interrogator, pass tone, posture, and hesitation. In a single hour she could tell who would bend, who would break, and who would remain dangerous. There were categories that carried consequence. FS meant fit for servitude, trained until a girl could move without question, then placed as a domestic in farmhouses with forged signatures binding her into indenture. GC meant grave candidate, those who resisted and were likely to be put into the hidden system of removal. TT ostensibly meant transferred, but in practice it signaled a removal into night corridors from which no receiving lecture ever emerged. Sister Rebecca kept notebooks that reduced humans to assessments. The theology that justified all of this was careful and clinical. Mother Agatha spoke of the womb of obedience, the erasure of self as purification, penance as architecture. The language made violence into an architectural plan. Sister Eugenie's tinctures then supplied proofs, fevered visions she would prize and parade during chapel as evidence of conversion. Sister Isolde supplied documentation, letters home rewritten, progress reports signed in the girls' hands though they had not touched a pen in months. If you are listening and this presses against you, type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Let that phrase be a small ritual against forgetting. The system was efficient because it relied on social comm. Families preferred the soft lie to a scandal, local clerics preferred the tidy records to trouble, inspectors arrived and left with conciliatory notes. Money lubricated silence, donations, patronage whispered thanks. Outside the walls the war carried on. Inside, machinery of a mission turned steadily. The ledger's 143 entries were thus fewer coincidences and more a ledgering of decisions made by people convinced they were fulfilling a higher duty. They believed sanctification required sacrifice, so they sanctified absence. Girls slipped from registers into a hidden red book. Each erasure presented as devotion to a higher duty, left the word always. The most damning record lived not in diocesan stacks, but hidden beneath a cot in Sister Isolde's room. She kept a red ledger, a short book without headings in which numbers and clipped replaced mercy. Line after line read like an index of erasure. 31, refused communion, removed. 5 spoke during night silence, confession failed, transferred. One entry simply bore a faint X. The red ledger made the white book lie honestly. The official record could be clean only because another book told truer, meaner things. Survivor testimony is sparse, almost invisible. Survivors were rare and rendered speechless by design. Yet one woman persisted. Sister Mary Caldwell escaped in 1892 and spent the rest of her days as a silent lay in Vermont. After her death, a small sheet was found inside the hollow crucifix she kept. An ugly scrap scrawled in a hand that trembled. "They came after Vespers," she wrote. "Always two. One held a lamp, one a rope. We were gagged. They told us we went to the vineyard. I heard screams in the basement. The furnace never died." Her notes gave shape to rumor. Brother Thorne kept a routine to the furnace. Officially it warmed laundry. In the ledger its use matched a pattern of departures. The staff used the whispers of piety to justify labor that had other ends. The girls labeled GC, grave candidates, were those who retained a self after weeks of fasting and isolation. They were the ones who vanished most quickly. Sister Isolde's red notes used coded shorthand. Later historians would debate what TT meant. Some argued it stood for transfer to another institution, others suspected a darker euphemism. Evidence pointed elsewhere. The red entries correlated with missing beds, with names scrubbed from baptismal pages, with baptismal forms found later that had been acid washed until ink faded. One baptism fragment recovered in 1974 showed 23 names reduced to smears. Only Clara Mullin's name remained legible. Families received forged missives, progress reports, cheery attestations signed in their child's script, and believed their daughters improved, never knowing the ledger tracked a different currency absence. I chased paper into ground. Records led me to municipal files, to a demolition report from 1974, to a collapsed drain where someone had tried to scrub history. The report was bureaucratic and bland. The people who wrote it did not intend the fragments to become evidence. Yet in a Clay Street pipe, workers found a baptismal slip with names washed by acid until only one remained legible. A forensics note recorded that margins showed chemical usage inconsistent with clerical practice. Someone had tried to erase ink physically as well as administratively. Old towns remember differently in corners. In the diner where I first heard the name Hill House, the regulars told stories stitched with a mission. Men who had worked the old timber yards remembered Brother Thorne's boots late at night. A woman with arthritis remembered a girl who had been sent to a distant household and returned months later with eyes like a clockwork doll. Locals used euphemisms: sent away, retired, gone to a convent. The polite words were a social form of erasure. The architecture still spoke. The foundation lines remained under a field of daisies. Where the laundry once stood, the grass bent like a wound. I walked the earth and felt the way certain patches of soil kept heat, even on a cool morning. A neighbor remembered heat and smoke during certain winters, and how children learned to avoid the hill. These memories were not dramatic headlines, they were small habits. Empty places at tables, a last-seen jacket hung in a shed, whispers that someone had seen a cart at dusk. I found a fragment of one girl's writing, hidden in a church wall during prior renovations. "Watch out until the voice is thin. They teach us to pray like machines." That line could have been dismissed as romantic hyperbole, if not for the ledger and for other corroborations. Patterns emerged. A network of donations, of quiet wealth exchanged for silence, of clerical endorsements that smoothed inquiries. Where public records stopped, private practice continued to do the work of vanishing. The city sanitized its history as institutions do, but stains remain. Paper scraps, a crucifix hollowed for secrets, the way older women still flinch at certain hymns. The ledger's 143 lines were not accidental. They were the residue of choices made by people who mixed doctrine and bureaucracy until absence looked like piety. I came to understand complicity as a practiced craft. Clara's marks became a map of absence. Each cross under a slat was a memory stitched into wood, a private liturgy against forgetting. She hid scraps of paper in her seam, snatches of names that otherwise evaporated: Elsie, Winterfred, Joe, Marion. She kept their traits like contraband, Elsie's laughter, Winterfred's constant wiping at a phantom tear, Joe's small jokes about birds. Their humanity threaded through the ledger's cold columns, resisting the arithmetic of removal. At night, Clara learned the rhythms of escape even when escape was impossible. She memorized the shift patterns of the quiet choir, the odd clink in Brother Thorn's step when he carried food to particular cells, the timing of chapel when Sister Eugenie liked to move through with a pocket of tepid tea. These small observations became a map of where danger lived and where small kindness might still be traded. An extra crust, a stolen warmth, a whisper held beneath the mattress. Friendships formed like conspiracies. The girls developed quiet signals. 2 fingers at the hem, a cough pattern, a way of pressing a palm to the heart to mean I remember you. They shared what they could: a pressed flower, a dried berry, a sliver of chalk. The staff responded by widening punishment to entire dorms. Communal atonement taught them that to care was to endanger others. Still, the acts of tenderness persisted. A hidden braid, a shared joke in a threadbare seam, these were rebellions. Clara listened for names in the night, mapping the vanishing like a litany. When a girl's bed was stripped and a number removed from the board, Clara would trace her cross deeper. She began to record patterns on small burnt scraps and folded them into her mattress stitching. Those scraps became evidence by accident, kept in a tin later found in the hollow of an attic chest. They were small, jagged things, lists of names, dates that matched ledger lacunae, a child's messy explanation that they had been taken. Her courage was quiet. It was the courage of someone who kept memory alive in the space provided to her: a seam, a chalk line, a whispered name. It was the most dangerous kind of bravery because it asked nothing of anyone else, only that one person remember. And in a house devoted to erasure, memory was an act of defiance. Her small rebellions would later become the ledger's indictment. The house refined a cruel science. Sister Eugenie recorded each subject's reaction to tinctures, cataloging tolerance, fevered visions, and the likelihood of confession. She considered herself a healer but kept meticulous notes of diminishing resistance: 2 teaspoons of a bitter draught on an empty stomach, sleep broken into shifting fragments, dreams coaxed into compliance. Some girls began to see angels in fever, others reported loss of chronological time. These visions were harvested and presented as spiritual renovation. Brother Thorn's work was quieter but no less experimental. He built reflection chambers that distorted perception, night corridors that allowed staff to move unseen, and cellars where voices could be muffled into nothing. Girls he favored, those he found interesting or useful, were taken and never returned. Tools vanished from the laundry. Floors bore smudges of oil and ash. The furnace, ostensibly for linens, kept a rhythm that matched disappearances. Sister Isolde's talent was erasure, not in violence, but in paperwork. She studied speech patterns and learned how to mimic a child's signature so perfectly families did not suspect forgery. She wrote letters describing spiritual progress, signed in the child's hand though that child had not touched a pen in months. Isolde also kept a red ledger that used shorthand and codes. Historians later argued over acronyms, but when you match red entries with missing beds, with chromatized baptisms, with furnace logs, the pattern sings. If you have arrived here and feel the world tilt, type "the veil is broken" twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Make that small act an identity ritual to resist institutional forgetting. In chapel, selected girls were paraded as proof of spiritual success, eyes rolling, testimonies staged as conversion. Staff logged these episodes as grace. Patrons accepted those reports. Over decades, the technique became a script: intake, reflection, tincture, confession, placement, or disappearance. The house turned obedience into a process and trained clerics and patrons to accept that narrative. It learned to hide itself. The economy around St. Elora ate absence. Girls categorized FS, fit for servitude, were trained until their obedience became profitable. They learned to move without thought, to fold a shirt the same way for years, to answer summons with a small bow. Then the order arranged placements, unofficial indentures signed with sign, Elora's authority and the thumbprint of a grateful patron. These placements were sold as rescuer guiding family moral instruction work. In truth, they were transfers of HOND, trauma-bonded labor. Private houses across counties received these girls. Some families reported gratitude, others treated them as quiet property. The girls ceased to exist on public rolls. Their labor fed households and their silence fed reputations. The wealthy benefited. Domestic chores performed without complaint, secrets kept, mouths stitched by habit. The church gained patrons, the order gained cover. The ledger's FS entries thus converted human beings into units of domestic profit. Those listed as GC fared worse. Resistant, talkative, too attached. Qualities flagged as dangerous. GC girls were managed through a sequence of intensifying punishments, then discreet removals. The red ledger's terse notes matched absences and furnace cycles. TT marks remained the most opaque. Historians would later match those marks to nights when the laundry furnace burned for longer hours and beds were stripped in the morning without explanation. The network that made this possible was broad. Clerics who whispered recommendations, family advisors who drafted discreet letters, carriage drivers who delivered children at dawn, each played a part. The order cultivated relationships with lawyers and merchants who provided the legal veneer needed to move girls out of public sight. Donations from patrons were occasionally recorded as endowments for spiritual repair, and then quietly redirected to the running costs of a house that would never explain what those costs concealed. I traced one trail to a manor 20 miles away where a girl listed as improved worked for decades, her name replaced in inventories with the word servant. Her burial was a footnote at best, and no public record exists. Section 10. Some of the clearest traces were not in the asylum itself, but in the margins of church correspondence. Inspection notes, donation receipts, and a sealed bundle in a distant archive labeled with ink now faded. I petitioned access and found fragments, a gatekeeper's note, a priest's hesitating endorsement, a magnate's brief thanks. One file contained a torn page from Sister Rebecca's notebook. She catalogued girls by posture and response as if compiling specimens. Number 28, passive, promising for labor. Number 36, defiant, risk. There were also inspection reports with blank spaces where candor should have been. A visiting cleric in 1866 praised the house's moral rigor after a courteous tour. A mid-century health inspector noted lack of ventilation but recommended no changes. Letters from local magistrates were procedural and polite. The pattern suggested more than negligence, a coalition of convenience among people who profited from order and feared scandal more than injustice. I sent copies of materials to 2 historians who specialize in ecclesiastical records. One responded with a note about institutional incentives. In times of social upheaval, orders gained latitude to act as private custodians. Another pointed to the mechanics of silence, forged letters, sponsored inspections, and the smoothing power of donations. The evidence did not require conspiracy, it required a social willingness to look away. Access to Vatican-sealed materials proved complicated. Some fragments exist in vaults and are accessible only with ecclesiastical permission, others were catalogued without clear provenance. The broken threads suggested an international web, correspondence, gifts, and recommendations that crossed diocesan boundaries. The ledger, though local, fit into a broader practice. Institutions that managed deviation through removal rather than rehabilitation. One fragment described a donor's gift conditional on silence. Another recorded a priest's plea not to stir scandal. Sister Isolde's forged letters often used phrases like progressing marvelously. These bureaucratic niceties were the grease that kept a violent mechanism quiet, trading accountability for reputation and sealing absence beneath official ink. It was organized, legal, and monstrously ordinary to observe. Standing where the asylum once rose, the shape of the place became legible in absence. Foundations hinted at cruciform geometry, the main hall's stones lay scattered, the laundry's outline pressed into dirt. I walked the earth at dawn and felt how the ground retained memory, cool patches that rose in warmth like old embers. The hill seemed to inhale when wind passed, as if the place still drew in breath. The chapel's footprint suggested a central spine leading toward where an incinerator might have lain. Stones bore traces of lime and soot. Narrow slits at waist height along corridor lines read as observation slits, eyes in walls. Trapdoors were reported by laborers' descendants. One man remembered an iron ring his grandfather had once pried loose to show curious boys how the world was built to hide itself. I descended into the cellar where a thin hollow had been left by a previous dig. The smell was of damp and lime, Ash mingled with earth in small pockets beneath the soil, not dramatic but persistent. In one place a shard of ceramic, glazed and unremarkable, bore a child's faint thumbprint in its glaze. In another a small button with embroidered thread remained, the sort found in a girl's uniform. These were not the sort of finds that blow open a case in court, but they were human markers. Walking the site felt like listening. The wind shaped stories in a particular way over certain stones. A crook of land near the brook always seemed warmer. The grass flattened in a pattern that suggested repeated passage. One neighbor showed me where her grandmother had once refused to cross a field after dusk. The reasons were not dramatic. A child's apology left at a doorstep, a coat hung and never reclaimed, a lullaby hummed under breath and then never again. Architecture here functioned as testimony. The structure had been designed for surveillance and silence. Each narrow window, each thick wall, each hidden corridor signaled an intent to sequester experience. The ruins did not shout, but they whispered with authority. In those whispers it became evident that absence had been manufactured with care, and that the place was less a mistake than a designed outcome. I left with the impression that the land itself was complicit, stones that remembered and people who had been taught to forget. The silence there felt organized, like archived grief. Not all truth needs spectacle, some truths are quiet accumulations. In municipal archives I found a bundle of baptism slips with ink, so thin it looked like a ghost. Chemical residue marked margins, someone had tried to erase names. Only one name remained legible on an otherwise blank page: Clara Malin, baptized 1864. A later note tacked to the bundle recorded that 23 other names had been rendered illegible. Such acts of erasure were both physical and administrative. Archaeologists who inspected the site decades later reported small ash concentrations and fragments consistent with high heat exposure. They recorded shards of vitrified glass and traces of bone in the soil in non-graphic technical language. The report was careful, evidentiary and tempered, but the pattern it revealed matched ledger anomalies: beds stripped, baptisms scrubbed, furnace cycles extended on particular nights. Families who pressed for answers were met with belligerent courtesy. Sister Isolde's replies came in scripted warmth: "Your daughter is progressing marvelously. She will return to full duty when divinely ready." Those who persisted were given excuse after excuse or an offer of spiritual counsel. In a society where clerical opinion held weight, such answers were often sufficient. When a town accepts a tidy letter over a painful inquiry, disappearance becomes administratively invisible. Over the asylum's 28 years, the ledger registered 143 names with ambiguous fates. Those lines were not mere numbers. They represented people removed from communal life, their stories folded into parish silence. What I learned was that erasure had multiple hands: the women who administered pain, the clerics who smoothed reports, the patrons who accepted labor, the neighbors who chose conversation over curiosity. Paper and earth corroborated one another. A child's button, a thumb-impressed shard, a ledger line, a chemical trace on a baptismal paper. Each piece was small, and when assembled they became a map. The map told a single terrible story repeated over years. The Order of St. Elora had learned how to make absence procedural, and a community had been willing to let procedure stand in for justice. Sister Mary Caldwell's scrap, hidden in a crucifix, named lamp, rope and vespers. It described screams in basements and the furnace never dying. Her testimony, dismissed for years, aligns with physical traces. The ledger thus became testimony. The paper itself accused those who believed their hands were clean. Complicity had been ordinary, regular, and terrifyingly mundane indeed. Once I had assembled physical traces and documents, the question shifted from who did this to how a society permitted it for so long. The mechanics of suppression at St. Elora were methodical and had echoes in other institutions: the routine of quieting complaints, the ritual rewriting of narrative, and the steady investment of social capital to prevent inquiry. It became clear that the asylum's methods were not relics but templates, techniques adaptable to any institution seeking to control depopulation of dissent. Consider the tools: enforced silence, pharmacological flattening, architectural isolation, bureaucratic mimicry. Each is a lever of power when combined with the right social context. Deference to authority, fear of scandal, and economic benefit for the protectors. The techniques were ancient in origin but modern in execution. They blended monastic discipline with a bureaucratic logistics that created plausible deniability. I began to look for patterns elsewhere in reform schools with closed records, in charitable institutions that accepted donations in exchange for discretion, in political systems that prefer tidy numbers to messy truth. What distinguishes St. Elora is scale and procedural clarity, a house that systematized erasure and trained a network of people to supply the necessary silences. Historians often call such arrangements moral economies, ways communities regulate transgression by trade of secrecy for social peace, of labor for quiet. But moral economies can calcify into machinery. When that happens, disappearance stops being a contingent horror and becomes institutional practice. That slow morphing is what frightened me most, the translation of sporadic cruelty into a set of reliable operations. I began interviewing workers from other institutions, and patterns repeated reports that sinned only by omission, donors who preferred quiet, administrators trained to smooth trouble. In every case, the machinery relied on ordinary choices, choosing convenience over confrontation, choosing plausible letters over searching graves. That realization shifted my work. I stopped seeking dramatic proof and began collecting small consistencies, signatures, schedule regularities, expense ledgers. Because pattern is prosecution, pattern is memory. To speak of St. Elora is to speak of systems of control that predate the house itself. The theological language Mother Agatha used, breaking the mirror, filling the vessel, had roots in older practices of erasure and conversion. What was new was the marriage of those metaphors to industrial management, scheduling, classification, files. When theology borrows ledger techniques, it gains a bureaucratic elbow to the throat of individual memory. Psychological control at St. Elora operated on multiple axes. Isolation dissolved context, enforced fasting, rewired physiological thresholds, pharmacological agents blurred continuity of experience, ritualized humiliation reframed shame as purification. Each method alone could be brutal, but together they produced a manufactured interiority. Girls came to distrust their recollection, to question whether pain was deserved, and to deflect blame inward. That fracturing of subjectivity made testimony rare and unreliable. The house cultivated a grammar of obedience. Staff taught girls to narrate their own stories through a sanctioned vocabulary. When a girl spoke outside that vocabulary, she was corrected. When she persisted, she was marked. Language itself was a contested field. Sister Isolde's forgeries rewrote the public record, while Sister Eugenie's tinctures rewrote inner life. In such an environment, truth had to compete with state-sponsored piety and bureaucratic artifice. Ancient corruption wore a modern coat. The methods used at St. Elora resembled ritual purges and confessional devices from earlier centuries, but they were executed with modern discipline. That synthesis is important to note. Corruption becomes more durable when it adapts, when it learns to use the prevailing technologies of its age. St. Elora adapted, folding ecclesiastical rhetoric into administrative practice until disappearance looked like discipline. Look for markers, dual records that disagree, donors who insist on discretion, personnel trained to mimic families' handwriting, routine medical notes euphemizing sedation, architecture that prioritizes sequestration. These are not dramatic clues but structural ones. They reveal a preference for containment and reputation over inquiry. Spotting them early prevents a system from calcifying into something like St. Elora and demands public accountability. The asylum's documented operation spans 28 years, an institutional arc long enough to produce technique, habit, and social infrastructure. Between 1862 and the final fragments of records in the 1890s, 143 names entered the house's red and white books, with fates that were intentionally ambiguous. The numeric pace matters because it shows a persistent practice, not a blip. Repetition proves systemization. Repetition proves policy more than accident. Closure came quietly. The building fell into disrepair. Epidemics and shifting social structures reduced intake. Donors shifted focus. By the time demolition crews came in the 20th century, much had already been dispersed, buried, or miscatalogued. What physical evidence remained was fragmentary. The institutional memory had migrated into private collections and the habits of those who still preferred silence. After closure, some women survived into other lives. Sister Mary Caldwell fled and lived as a laywoman in Vermont. She left the fragment in a crucifix that later betrayed what the house had tried to hide. Others, if they survived, were absorbed into households as servants, their histories subsumed in inventories. The social significance of each disappearance varied. For some families, a lost daughter was replaced with the narrative of moral retreat. For others, it became a wound remembered in private. Public responses were muted. Local papers published brief benign notices about the house and its pious mission. Clerics accepted the narrative and parish bulletins lauded perseverance. The legal system of the era was poorly equipped to interrogate ecclesiastical custody, especially when parish authorities certified the institution's methods. A bureaucratic deference thereby became legal cover. My work forced questions: how to translate fragments into a public account, how to compel archives to open bundles, how to persuade descendants that absence might be injustice. It required accumulation, matching names, tracing placements, compiling lists of correspondences. It required confronting institutions that preferred tidy reputations to truth. The ledger's lines demanded a response: naming, public reckoning, and the return of dignity to vanished lives. Pursuing the story demanded more than patience, it demanded endurance against institutional resistance. Archives required permissions denied or delayed. My requests for sealed bundles were met with bureaucracy and sometimes with thinly veiled admonitions about propriety. Clerical offices pointed to privacy concerns. Legal counsel for dioceses reminded me of libel risk. In several cases, correspondence simply did not exist in public files where I expected it. I had to chase families, private papers, and attic trunks instead. The church's representatives were rarely overtly hostile, but they were practiced at rephrasing inquiries into pastoral concerns. A polite refusal, a suggestion of mediation, an offer of a spiritual review, these were methods of delay that functioned as denial. When I pressed further, I encountered subtle legal warnings from diocesan lawyers who suggested that public accusations should be avoided. The message was clear: if you push, expect opposition calibrated in procedural terms. At times I received threats thinly veiled as advice, legal letters implying defamation suits, a quiet suggestion that certain documents were sensitive, and a reminder that families preferred privacy. These were not the crude intimidations of pulp thrillers. They were professional cautions that rely on cost and time to deter investigators. Institutions can weaponize civility and legal process as effectively as any overt obstruction. Yet resistance was not total. There were archivists who, off the record, guided me to neglected boxes. There were descendants who, when shown evidence, chose truth over comfort and provided letters that had been folded into trunks for generations. I found former staff, aged and reticent, who offered small confirmations. The case therefore advanced in fragments, propelled by small acts of courage and the slow erosion of institutional opacity. One archivist led me to a trunk that yielded a folded letter from a mother begging for return. A descendant provided diaries locked in a cedar chest. Lawyers helped subpoena records. Academics lent credibility. Building a coalition of truth required persistent subpoenas, FOIA-style requests where possible, and the patience to transcribe fragile handwriting into public testimony and community rallies. As evidence accumulated, patterns became impossible to ignore. The ledger's 143 lines corresponded to specific absences: beds stripped, baptismal names chemically abraded, furnace cycles prolonged. By triangulating ledger entries, baptismal fragments, placement lists, and oral testimony, I could trace the likely arc for many girls' intake, classification, forced labor or removal, and in too many cases, disappearance from public record. The shape was ugly and clear, it was methodical. I compiled names where possible: Clara, Malin, Elsie, Winterfred, Joe, Marion, names that threaded through scraps, mattress seams, and torn hymnal pages. Where a name could not be linked to a post-placement record, I marked it as unresolved and kept searching. Some were matched to households where payroll and inventories suggested long-term domestic service without ever being paid by name. Others ended in places that left trails of ash recorded by later archaeologists. The ledger's lines were a map of institutional outcomes, not accidents. There were cases that resisted tidy reconstruction, gaps that practice could not fill. For those I relied on patterns: the rhythm of furnace usage, the timing of donor correspondence, the inscriptions on private letters. When patterns converged, they became evidence. When patterns diverged, I catalogued the anomalies for future inquiry. This forensic patience is dull but relentless. It builds beyond rumor and emotion, turning memory into a chain of corroborated connections. Confronting this reality required presentation. I drafted dossiers, assembled exhibit boxes with photocopies, artifacts, and testimonies, and shared them with legal counsel and sympathetic scholars. The goal was not just accusation, but remediation, naming those affected, pressing archives to release sealed items, and asking institutions to account for donations and transactions that had funded disappearance. Some institutions responded with denials, others opened doors. A parish council releasing a chest of letters, a patron returning a donation record, a county archive uncataloguing a sealed file. These were fractures in the armor. The real remedy demands more public hearings, reparations, memorialization. We must build a memorial record, a public registry, and insist that children who vanished be named in roll calls, not reduced to ledger shorthand. This story ends where remembering begins. The ledger that once sought to make absence tidy now demands witness. Saying a name aloud is a small act of repair. When you hear Clara, Elsie, Winterfred, Joe, Marion, you shift the ledger's balance. A column of ink gives way to a human voice. The project of naming is not theatrical. It is a slow reversal of bureaucratic appetite, a reclamation of personhood from the paperwork that tried to swallow it. I do not promise final justice here. Institutions can be slow, resistant, and ingenious at self-preservation. But the work matters because the alternative is easier forgetting, which is what allowed St. Elora to operate. Remembering is a discipline. It requires archives opened and annotated, families willing to look and speak, scholars ready to verify, legal systems willing to hold institutions to account. It requires communities prepared to be uncomfortable and to convert discomfort into inquiry. If listening to this has altered you, then carry a name into your day. Speak it once in a room where forgetting has weight. Let memory be a small, persistent practice, a social ritual that resists tidy erasure. The girls of St. Elora were given numbers, assigned categories, and catalogued into silence. We can reassign them to language, to history, to story. That simple reallocation dismantles a ledger entry's power. Some of you will ask what practical steps to take. Start with records. Ask local archives whether sealed materials exist and request access. Ask clergy whether donation conditions included confidentiality. Push for public registries that list institutional admissions alongside outcomes. Support scholars and lawyers who take these cases. Help build memorials in town squares or digital spaces where names cannot be reduced to rows and columns. Above all, be wary of systems that prefer convenience over curiosity. Institutions will always offer tidy answers. Your role is to ask the questions they hope you won't ask. Remembering is a radical action because it insists on presence. In remembering the missing, we slow the machinery that made them disappear. We disturb ease. We keep the ledger in the light. I continue the work because names matter. There will be hearings and resistance and victories. Bring witnesses, bring patience, bring outrage that refuses to be polite. If you carry one name forward, you have already refused erasure. The ledger will not be the last word, memory will be.